Hi, everyone. In today's podcast, we're going to talk about using childbirth education for pain relief during labor. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Evidence-Based Birth podcast. I hope you've been enjoying our pain management series. Today, we're going to talk about childbirth education for relieving pain during labor. Childbirth education is also sometimes called antenatal education, and overall it has pretty broad goals, but some of its more specific goals can range from increasing your self-confidence, helping you prepare for birth, helping your partner learn how to support you during birth, and helping you prepare for parenting and breastfeeding. Another common goal of childbirth education is to help you form a social support network and to meet other parents in your community who are going through the same process. But today we're going to focus in about the effects of childbirth education on pain during labor. So how could we use childbirth education to relieve pain during labor? Well, researchers think that childbirth education might work by changing how you perceive pain during labor. In other words, decreasing the unpleasantness of pain. If you haven't listened already, I recommend that you go back and listen to our podcast called The Overview of Pain Management, which was the first podcast in this series. In that podcast, we talk about several different mechanisms that can act on pain so that your brain interprets it differently or is less able to interpret those feelings as pain. The theory is that childbirth education acts on your central nervous system to relieve pain. We call this the central nervous system control method of pain management. And basically what it means is that acquiring knowledge and skills before you give birth may activate thoughts and mental processes in your brain so that you perceive less pain or your pain feels less unpleasant during labor. So how many people take childbirth education classes? The latest research we have on this in the United States comes from the Listening to Mothers study, which was published in 2013. In that study, they found that roughly 1 in 3 mothers who gave birth in United States hospitals had taken some kind of childbirth preparation course. This study was carried out by de Klerk et al. And researchers at Childbirth Connection. They found that about 59% of first-time mothers had taken a class before they gave birth to a baby that year, compared with 17% of experienced parents. 1 in 2 mothers took a class either with that pregnancy or with a prior pregnancy. This means that in the United States, only about half of parents ever took a childbirth education class. Of those who took a class, about half took a class that met every week for a period of several weeks, so a series of classes. 25% roughly took a class in one day, and about 25% took a class over 2 days, such as a weekend class. Now, the major focus of most birth classes tends to be descriptive, describing the labor and birth process. What to expect when you go to the hospital is the focus of about 29% of classes. And this theme is most common in the one-day childbirth education class. Learning about your care options and the benefits and risks of your different options was the theme in about 20% of classes, according to the Listening to Mothers survey. The Listening to Mothers 3 survey also found that most people in the United States take hospital-based classes. Other researchers have examined hospital-based classes and found that they tend to serve clients with a diverse array of goals and values. For example, you may have a large class or small class with parents, some who know they want an epidural as soon as they get to the hospital and others who want an unmedicated birth. Researchers have also found that some hospital classes may condition you to accept the hospital routines and prepare you for what to expect when you get to the hospital. Some hospital childbirth educators also sometimes feel pressure not to teach the full range of options if those options are not supported by providers at that hospital. On the other hand, some childbirth educators say that they don't feel pressure. So that's probably something that varies from hospital to hospital. On the other hand, about 18% of people in the U.S. in the Listening to Mothers survey said that they take a childbirth class from an independent educator who is not affiliated with the hospital. Researchers who've examined those types of classes have found that they tend to teach people to be critical consumers of their healthcare, and that these independent classes tend to focus on a normal physiologic birth philosophy, helping prepare you to have as physiologic a birth as possible. In an earlier Listening to Mothers survey that was published in 2007, researchers found that after a typical childbirth class, many parents had more trust in hospitals and less fear of medical interventions. They also had a greater trust in their caregivers. caregivers. Almost all of the parents in that survey wanted to be informed about the major benefits and risks of different interventions, such as inductions or cesareans. But the majority of parents could not answer questions correctly about these interventions, even after they'd taken a typical childbirth class. A common philosophy today that I hear among childbirth educators when I travel around the U.S. talking with them is to hear them say something like this: I don't believe in advocating for a certain way of giving birth. I simply believe in the parent's right to make an informed choice. This philosophy sounds really wonderful, and most childbirth educators that I know would say that they agree with that philosophy. The problem is, as Judith Lothian says in her really well-written article about childbirth education, and by the way, all of these references, and when I mention studies, they are in the blog article for that topic. So just go to evidencebasedbirth.com/blog and find the article that goes with that podcast for the references. But the problem is, as Judith Lothian says, is that in many hospital settings around the world, sometimes choice can be an illusion. This means that childbirth educators may be educating parents about different options, and they're educators encouraging them to learn about these options. But if parents are entering a specific hospital system where there's a very heavy emphasis on following institutional routines, policies, and traditions, it might be very difficult, if not impossible, for parents to access all of their options, including non-drug options for pain management. So what does the evidence say about childbirth education for pain relief during labor? The truth is, up until this point, we have not had a lot of research evidence to guide current and future childbirth education efforts. For example, online classes are becoming more and more popular, but we don't have any studies showing whether or not these efforts are effective. There are also very few randomized controlled trials on childbirth education in general. For one reason, it's very difficult to conduct randomized trials on this topic. A lot of people have strong feelings one way or another about whether or not they want to take a childbirth class. And so they might not agree to be in a study where they're randomly assigned to have childbirth education or nothing. Some researchers feel that it's unethical to assign people to no education. Also, every childbirth class is different. There are unlimited numbers of childbirth education programs out there, all with different strengths and weaknesses and formats and styles and content. So just because one study looks at one type of childbirth education program doesn't mean that those results would apply to other childbirth education programs. Also, childbirth education does not exist in a vacuum. What I mean by that is that, like I said earlier, you could take a childbirth class, be educated about all your options for pain management, and be prepared to use them. But if you walk into a setting or have a provider who is not truly supportive of your choices, you might find yourself in a situation where you're not able to access those options that you educated yourself about. For example, there were some classic studies on Lamaze childbirth classes that took place in the mid-1970s. These are really interesting studies that I would encourage you to read. And again, I'm linked to them in the blog article. But they found some benefits of childbirth classes, but they also found something really strong called the provider effect. How that worked is, even though the women were educated that episiotomies are not necessary and may be harmful, nearly 100% of all the women in these studies had episiotomies, whether or not they got childbirth education. This is because of the, quote, provider effect. In other words, if you have a provider who is not supportive of your goals and wishes, and there's a mismatch between what you want and what your provider wants, something like an episiotomy could happen regardless of whether or not you wanted it or consented to it. That's slightly getting off topic. We could do a whole different podcast on that topic, but if you want to learn more about it, I would recommend Googling the words obstetric violence. You could also subscribe to the podcast called Birth Monopoly, which has a heavy emphasis on learning about obstetric violence. So in 2007, Cochrane researchers published a review where they tried to combine several randomized controlled trials on childbirth education. They found a total of 9 randomized trials with a little more than 2,000 participants total. In 2011, they found 58 additional trials that were awaiting classification, meaning that they hadn't gone through them yet to decide if they were going to put them in the next review. But so far, there has not been any update from the Cochrane collaboration, and so the latest results we have are from the 2007 review. The few studies they were able to include in the 2007 review came from the United States, Canada, and Iran. Each study tested a completely different educational class. For example, in one study, the childbirth class was only 30 minutes about the stages of labor. Another study looked at teaching fathers parenting techniques. The Cochrane researchers were not able to draw any conclusions from these studies because the studies themselves were so different, and they all looked at different outcomes, so they couldn't combine them and draw any kind of conclusions. In 2015, a group of researchers led by Brixval looked at 17 randomized trials from Western countries. Again, they had the same problems as the Cochrane researchers. They said that they could not draw any conclusions because the educational classes were so different. Some classes just provided 1 or 2 hours of childbirth education, while others provided up to 48 hours worth of classes. So the reviewers basically said, we can't draw any conclusions about the effectiveness of childbirth education. There was, however, a randomized control trial that came out in the year 2016 from Australia that seems to be really important, and it was led by a researcher with the last name Levitt, Levett. And this study is really important, and so I want to spend the rest of our podcast talking about the study. It took a really unique approach to using childbirth education specifically for pain relief during labor. This study took place at 2 hospitals in Australia where they randomly assigned 176 first-time mothers to either have a comprehensive 2-day childbirth class based on the She Births trademark company techniques or standard care, which consisted of the typical hospital childbirth class. The typical childbirth class at the hospital was mostly descriptive, focusing on stages of labor, how to know when labor is beginning, and when to go to the hospital. It also covered some parenting and postpartum issues. The control group in this hospital class was not instructed to practice any techniques at home, and when they surveyed them after the birth, they found that, in fact, none of them did practice any comfort measures or techniques for labor at home. The intervention group got a 2-day childbirth education course based on the She Births principles, which you can Google the words She Births and you can find a description of this class. It included 6 different non-drug comfort measures for labor. These comfort measures included acupressure, visualization and relaxation, breathing, massage, yoga techniques, and helping the partner learn how to support the birthing person through labor. The classes in this intervention group took about 14 to 15 hours total to complete, and there were anywhere from 2 to 12 couples in the class with an average of 8 couples per class. These couples were encouraged to practice the techniques that they learned in class at home. On average, they found that the couples practiced 13 techniques per week until the birth of their baby. The researchers' primary goal was to look at the rate of epidural use in both groups. They found that only 24% of people who had the She Births group had an epidural, compared to 69% epidural rate in the traditional standard group that got the typical childbirth class. The intervention group also had a significantly lower rate of Pitocin augmentation and cesareans. The rate of Pitocin augmentation was 28% in the She Births group, compared to 58% in the group that had the typical childbirth class. And the cesarean rate was 18% in the She Births group and 33% in the typical hospital childbirth class. They also found that people who had the She Births class had a shorter second stage of labor, fewer cases of perineal tears or trauma, and fewer cases where the newborn needed to be resuscitated. Only 14% of their babies needed resuscitation, compared to 29% of people in the typical childbirth class. This research study is open access, and so I encourage you to find the link to it and read it because it's really interesting. They go on to give some information about what the intervention group found was most helpful. So the people who had the more in-depth childbirth class that covered all of these non-drug comfort measures, those couples found something called the blissful belly breath to be the most helpful during labor, so abdominal breathing. 60% of people who had that more intensive childbirth class used this technique during labor. Other techniques that the parents said they used most frequently included massage, acupressure, and visualization. Also, 35% of people in the She Births class used a technique called gentle birthing breaths that helped them slow down the birth of their baby and is meant to help protect their perineum. On average, the people who had the more intensive childbirth class reported using at least 4 of these techniques during labor. In contrast, less than 5% of anybody in the control group reported using any of the techniques that were taught in the more intensive class. So this study shows that childbirth education that focuses on non-drug comfort measures and encourages parents to practice those regularly before the birth of their baby results in less need for medical intervention during birth and better outcomes for newborns. Again, the complementary and alternative therapies that the parents were taught in this class included acupressure, which we've already covered in a podcast, visualization, breathing, yoga, and massage. And we'll be covering massage in an upcoming podcast in a few weeks. So in conclusion, systematic reviews have not been able to summarize the research evidence on this topic for us or to provide stronger evidence for childbirth education because every study that looks at childbirth education is so different that we can't lump or pool them together into a meta-analysis. Since high-quality evidence on childbirth education is lacking, the effects of childbirth education in general are unknown. It's not that childbirth education isn't being studied, it's that each research study is so different and each childbirth program is so different that we can't combine them to get a stronger result in a meta-analysis. It's also difficult to study childbirth education because of the provider effect. For example, if you tried to replicate the SheBirth study from Australia, for example, in a hospital that was not supportive of women choosing non-drug comfort measures, it might be very difficult for parents to actually use the techniques that they were taught. I definitely think that it would be beneficial for childbirth education programs and more childbirth educators to team up with researchers to get more research evidence on the types of childbirth classes that are being taught in your communities so that we can figure out the best way to teach parents. And also, we need research on how we can help create change in hospitals around the world to make them more accepting of parents who want to use the full range of methods of pain management, not just medication, but other methods as well. So I feel like we could have a really in-depth conversation about this, and I wish I was speaking with you face-to-face because I'm sure you're having a lot of comments and questions and thoughts in your brain right now about this topic. I'm not trying to say that there's no evidence for childbirth education. I think what I'm trying to say is the evidence is difficult to interpret because each childbirth class is so different. And I'm sure that there are plenty of childbirth education programs out there that are extremely effective at reducing the levels of pain during labor, both through helping empower parents and helping them feel more prepared so that they're less fearful and they greet childbirth with confidence and excitement, which would lessen their pain perception, but also classes that teach techniques for managing pain. In a couple weeks, we will be covering the evidence on hypnosis-based childbirth classes. So if you are a hypnobabies or hypnobirthing instructor and you are disappointed that I didn't talk about hypnosis, we will be covering that in a separate podcast. So that's it for this podcast about using childbirth education for pain relief during labor. If you haven't yet, I would invite you to leave a review of this podcast. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I read every review that's submitted. So if you have time today, please do me a favor and click on the leave a review button and give us an honest rating and review. Thanks, everyone, and I will see you next week. We're going to be talking about sterile water injections for pain relief during labor. Talk to you next week. Bye.